Hi, thanks everybody for joining today. Really appreciate your time and attention here. I'm Rob Koplowitz, and I'm a vice president and principal analyst with Forrester Research. And today we're going to talk to you about process insights and governance, which is your foundation for digital transformation. There's a whole bunch of stuff we want to cover today. And let me kind of kick off here by just giving you a sense of the agenda, where we're going to go. We're going to talk about this process imperative, this thing that's becoming very real for all of us, this razor sharp focus within so many organizations on driving process and probably more to the point, automating processes. We're going to talk about a technology challenge and opportunity. There's a lot of technology out there, maybe a little bit too much in some instances if it's not well managed. So we'll talk about strategies for looking at all the different technologies that are available to you and how to have them complement each other and not run into each other. And we'll leave you with some recommendations at the end. So with that in mind, let's kick off this whole topic on the process imperative and what's really driving this. And I think it's always interesting to look at the data. We love our data at Forrester. And if we ask the question, how are you applying digital technology within your organization? You've made a bunch of digital technology investments. You've been investing in skills. You've been investing in software. But what are you trying to accomplish with those technologies? We see a couple of answers here, which come out oddly enough at exactly the same number of answers for each. But they're very, very similar in terms of what people are trying to accomplish. So at 26.9%, we have those folks who are looking to completely transform end-to-end processes to better support a digital business strategy, very strategic goal. And then exactly the same number of respondents who say we plan to automate large numbers of currently manual processes to drive end-to-end digital transformation. These are very, very highly correlated, very highly analogous. Very, very similar types of goals. But what are we really trying to drive toward here? What is the impetus of this? And I think it's interesting in the current moment, right, around the crisis that we're all dealing with COVID-19. And I just want to draw your attention to something that happened very recently with our CEO, George Colony, who met with a whole bunch of CEOs and CIOs just as this whole crisis was beginning. And George asked the folks, what really is happening here? What are we going to really have to do to get through this? And there was one consensus answer. And the consensus answer was that the most digitized will survive. And more importantly, the most digitized will survive and thrive. So we're actually getting to this point where, COVID-19 sent a whole bunch of remote workers home, people who were never intended to work from home. And what we recognized was these processes that are still sitting in your organization. Some of them are paper-based. Some of them are around Excel and file servers. But there's a lot of them. These things are now getting in the way of work. These are getting in the way of customer onboarding. These are getting in the way of customer service. These are getting in the way of recognizing revenue. So we're in this scramble mode. And what we're asking folks during this is to say, look, these goals that you had, by the way, the numbers above the quote here, this all was from January. So this was before COVID-19 hit our reality, but the goals are very much real and will continue to be real. So we're not going to focus on COVID-19 here during this presentation. But what I do want to point out is you're driving towards automation, you're driving towards digitization, and that is how you should be working. This isn't going to be the last crisis, but more important, business agility is what you're striving towards, to being able to react to things extremely quickly. So if we take a step back and say, from the perspective of what you're trying to do with your process improvement organizations, what are the things that people are focusing on? And one answer we get back, which is consistent over the last 3 times we've done this survey, is accelerate digital business transformation. Folks are trying to digitize, they're trying to automate their organization, they're trying to drive more and more straight through processing, because while automation isn't always the answer, truth is it's almost always the answer, right? It's really what our clients are trying to drive towards, is an automation strategy and in support of this digital business. Look at the numbers here going from 2 years ago, where we asked them to look back 2 years, tell us what they're doing now, and project forward 2 years, 19% was the focus 2 years ago. Now it's 37%. And if we look forward, it goes up to 43%. So this is a very, very strategic goal. This is a goal that's laid out by the C-level. This is not tactical. This is not about cost reduction. This is not about error reduction. This is about changing my business model. And part of that, if we vector over and say, how important is improving customer service, your touch points to customers, and think of customer service here as a proxy for customers and patients and citizens and in some instances even employees. We see that go from 16% to 34%, staying fairly steady around 31%. So, the key takeaway from these two answers to this question is these are strategic objectives. These are coming from the C-level. So, a sea change in terms of how we think about process and how we go about defining how we're looking at processes. So we did a big governance study over the course of the summer. This was supported by some data, but as well as a lot of qualitative interviews as well. And what we discovered was a fairly consistent pattern for beginning to look at process and look at the process of automation at scale. So some of the things that are coming to bear here is different strategies for discovery. If we look at the top, an emergence of process mining to help us define processes at scale, also to be able to define an objective baseline of what my processes look like, and further to be able to analyze those processes, figure out where the processes are breaking down, figure out where we have opportunity for improvement, and potentially figure out where we have opportunity for automation. We see a new diligence around documentation, around being able to model processes collaboratively with the business, with an eye towards reengineering. A big uptake in the use of Six Sigmas, and that was a little bit of a surprise. We saw that falling off. But if we look at this document reengineering piece, we see Six Sigmas coming back into vogue, not necessarily to apply the methodology per se, but because they're experts in process and they bring particular insights to process optimization, as well as potentials for automation. And then lastly, we automate, and we automate quickly based on the output that we have from the above steps. And it repeats, right? It repeats in the sense that we're not defining these big, giant, honking kind of good old-fashioned BPM projects. We're moving much more quickly, much more iteratively, and the business is constantly involved in us helping to refine these businesses, optimize them, and change them on a moment's notice when the crisis hits or when the opportunity is at hand. So with that in mind, this is a different exercise than what we were used to. Those of us who kind of have been around process for a while, you think about it from the roots of BPM, extraordinarily valuable technology, I would argue, maybe more valuable now than ever. We'll get to that in just a moment. But those projects executed like turning an aircraft carrier. It was a huge effort around requirements analysis. It was a huge effort around defining the application, defining the interfaces, defining the touch points. And when you rolled those things out, you got huge payback, and we continue to get huge paybacks. And they're going to continue to be an anchor of our computing strategies. But side by side with that, we now see this new trend that says we have to do the next 100 applications, the next 150 processes. In some instances, we look at folks who have backlogs of 1,000 processes. And it's different. It's in its own way as challenging to do this as it was to turn the aircraft carrier. To say to the organization, we have broad organizational goals around improving customer experience, around digital transformation. What is your role in it? What is your part of this automation? And how do we do it at scale? And how do we do it in unison? And how do we do it without creating chaos? And it requires different types of tools and different types of thinking and different types of methodologies. And together, these things are what's going to drive digital transformation. We're still going to do large, sophisticated projects, and we're still going to do a lot more smaller situational processes that will be very, very nimble. And one of the examples of that is this very, very high correlation we see between process modeling, process improvement, and customer journey mapping. In fact, many of the process professionals we talk to claim they're doing process, that they're doing customer journey mapping. In fact, what they're doing is work that is in support of customer journey mapping. So if we look at this top layer here, this is a hypothetical customer journey map that Forrester uses quite often. And we look at this, and this starts with, Steve getting up and receiving his email. Let's be honest, folks, we're not doing customer journey mapping. We're process professionals, we're automation people. And we're not thinking about Steve getting out of bed in the morning and what his mood is like and how we should engage him. However, within this, if we look at this kind of micro journey that happens between the time Steve has to call in for help and wait 30 minutes on hold, that's an area that we very much could support. And these are showing up, again, dozens, hundreds of times, where automation can be applied in a very situational way if you work closely with your customer experience professionals to make it better. That was a drain point right there. That waiting for 30 minutes was an area where people left. They were no longer in a buying mode, and they were looking at my competitor because they were frustrated. We can fix that. We can fix that with automation. And then there's so many different instances where this comes to bear. So one of the things to consider here is that your processes don't respect your organizational boundaries. So why is it so important that we're looking at these strategic objectives like customer experience, like business transformation? Because they cross organizational boundaries. And traditionally, we looked at process optimization within silos, but we no longer have the luxury to do that. We now have to think about this as crossing organizational boundaries, these journeys, these processes that run across legacy systems. They run across different parts of the organization in terms of management structure. And we have a technology at our fingertips that's been around for a very, very long time that allows us to do that very, very effectively. And it's process automation. So, hence this sudden uptake, this massive interest in process and process optimization as a diligence. And a very interesting technology landscape that sits out there for us to take advantage of. So let's look at a few technologies and how they might work together across these different boundaries and across something like a very simple customer onboarding experience here. Everybody wants to show you a demo of their new chat bots or their new voice interaction models. They're all great. They create new opportunities for new classes of workers and new classes of customers to interact with our system. They create great new opportunities for people to work in areas that they haven't been able to before. I can interact with the process system in the field. I can do it from a poll. So, great technology meets low code. Appian, very, very, very strong in the low code space. You can build things very, very quickly with folks who didn't have to necessarily get the computer science degree. Very, very powerful capabilities. But really, I think at the core of low code is the ability to have a much, much closer software development relationship with the business, whether that business person is putting his or her hands on the keyboard and writing code or sitting side by side with somebody whose job it is. It's happening quickly, it's happening iteratively, and it happens in an ongoing basis. We have the application of things like rules and decisions. As part of my onboarding process, I have to assign a customer service rep. Well, that might have geographic considerations, that might have expertise considerations. There could be some amount of empathy analysis, being brought to bear on that. There could be regional time zone considerations. It's actually pretty complex. It's actually pretty easy to model with something like a rules engine. And now we have RPA. RPA has leapt onto the site, and the ability to take these things that we couldn't automate before, human task-oriented things where there was potentially no API available, very, very difficult to manage the ad hoc nature of it. All of a sudden, we can automate those things that we couldn't automate before. And we have many, many applications of artificial intelligence. We could, in parentheses here, fraud detection, customer, initial assessment of credit worthiness. We see computer vision being applied in many instances. We see natural language processing being applied for making sense out of unstructured data. So huge applications of AI. Now let's get back to BPM and what we now call at Forrester digital process automation, because we think it has taken a fundamentally different turn. But what came out of BPM and went into digital process automation is the ability to orchestrate and model and monitor these processes And that orchestration and modeling environment doesn't particularly care whether you're using native technology within the platform, whether you're using external technology, or whether you're doing that across human touch points. This is really difficult to do against sophisticated long-running processes. It's a problem that digital process automation vendors solved a long time ago, and is becoming really, really relevant and pertinent today. So with that in mind, we have a pretty broad definition of different capabilities that we have around different intelligent automation technologies, and this is only a partial list. There's more, and it continues to grow. But let's look at this top category of DPA Deep, which is where we would categorize Appian as one example. These are vendors that can handle sophisticated long-running processes that work across all of the technologies that sit below them. Now, the DPA Deep vendors are in a particularly strong position to handle your most sophisticated applications. They have a lot of complex characteristics that are unique to the DPA Deep vendors. Doesn't mean they can't go wide. Doesn't mean they're not the perfect solution for low code. In fact, they very often are. But look at the technologies sit below them. Dynamic case management, the ability to handle ad hoc capabilities. This is something that digital process automation vendors have been doing for a very, very long time within the existing platform, within the existing orchestration models. The addition of RPA, and that could come in multiple flavors. That could come with embedded RPA, the ability to handle bots directly within the environment, or through partnerships with other vendors who could potentially be your standard or handle particularly unique and sophisticated RPA requirements, rules, decisioning, embedded in these platforms, and artificial intelligence, and the ability to partner with external parties for the management of these AI related calls, often out to external cloud vendors, right? A lot of energy around Google and Azure and Amazon Web Services as the engines that drive a lot of these AI activities, but some of those being managed from within the orchestration environment of the digital process automation vendor. New things coming on, serverless is coming on, serverless events being managed directly within the environment, and the list will continue to grow. And I don't know that the digital process automation vendors really care that much that it continues to grow, because these are built on architectures that have always assumed that we're going to be bringing in multiple heterogeneous technologies into the environment. So that unique place for digital process automation around this emerging and pretty complicated, but ultimately complementary landscape of intelligent automation capabilities. Here's some good news, right? So if we look at this and say, okay, we're all up against this process imperative. One of the interesting pieces about this process imperative, if we look at it from the perspective of why are organizations actually doing a pretty good job of reacting to broken processes as relate to COVID-19? Well, because there's a whole bunch of technology that's already in place. Organizations are already heavily invested in RPA. If you look at the blue and the orange and the gray lines to the left here, you see those folks who are either invested today or expanding or planning to use. You see a lot of folks that are already invested in RPA, already invested in digital process automation capabilities, already invested in low-code capabilities. We're already going down this path, and we're going down this path rather aggressively, truth be known. But what we'll ask of folks is, okay, you've got great technologies that you can leverage today to get you through a crisis. Don't look at this as responding to a crisis. Look at this as providing business agility that is relevant to a crisis, but is relevant to the business world as well. It is going to be just as relevant when a digital disruptor enters your space with a new operating model and requires you to change your processes very, very quickly and automate things that you hadn't anticipated automating just a few days before. So good news on the technology landscape. We expect all of these bars to continue to grow as this stuff becomes more and more relevant. Now, there's a few different approaches to this, right? That's a whole hodgepodge of technology that I just threw out. And what we want to have you think about as you look about these different technologies is there's different ways that you can procure these, right? So I've got three different patterns here in the left around the approach side. And the first one is best of breed. And we've been in this best of breed versus suite conversation for as long as I've been in the industry, and you can tell from my video that's been a long time. So you bring in best of breed. That's great. You get to pick and choose the best technology that you have at your fingertips. A lot of benefits. The challenges that come up is you're becoming an integrator. You're integrating RPA into DPA. You're integrating a rules engine into your orchestration environment. And that brings two problems. Number one is backward-looking technical debt. You have to maintain it once you do that integration. But probably more relevant is forward-looking agility is really curtailed by this approach. So some will go that way. We understand it. We can look at a single vendor approach and get everything from one vendor. There might be packaging, there could be pricing considerations that make that, very attractive. Certainly it gets you out of the integration business for certain, but it ties you to a single vendor. That's it. You get to get what they offer. It may not be compatible with your broader architectural standards. It may not allow you to pick a best of breed product when you need it. Increasingly what we're seeing, and I think is particularly unique to the digital process automation vendors, is this bottom row here, a primary vendor that also acts as an integrator. So a vendor that will have a variety of the technology that you have available, certainly digital process automation, application development, being primary, but they may offer RPA, they may offer RPA relationships and partnerships and pre-integration with leading RPA vendors. They may offer rules capabilities and decisioning capabilities, but the ability to integrate external products as well. They're going to integrate your content capabilities or have them inherent in the system for you as well. And what that offers you is the opportunity to get towards best of breed. They tend to be with industry leading solutions, which is usually a very good place to start. But they take you out of the integration business. They move that integration vendor burden over to that primary vendor. So again, there's a lot of folks that are out there partnering. We find that the digital process automation vendors are particularly aggressive around partnering because it's just the nature of how processes execute. So that final line item, it may not be the answer for you, but it's one that we see emerging as a primary response to how folks are looking at the complexity of the intelligent automation landscape. So I'm going to leave you with a few recommendations here. First off, we're going to ask folks to look at centralizing your strategy for process improvement. How do you go about discovering your processes? How do you go about modeling those processes, documenting them, and automating them? You're going to do it a lot. So let's think about routinizing that for scale, not the big turning the aircraft carrier, but how do I do this 1,000 times involving a lot of my workforce who will ultimately be a part of this? And then automate for outcomes. Don't automate for the sake of automation. If I could just come up with a random example, an organization that tells me my goal is to drive, 1,000 RPA bots into our environment this year, I would have to ask for what? For what outcome? If you're trying to tell me that you've got a new product and you want 80% of the folks who are onboarding to that new product to come on straight through and it has to work from a mobile device, I understand that. That's a business outcome. And we can apply technology to that. But we have to understand the work before we make any decisions around automation. Next, there's a new class of developers emerging. These are your business people. They know your business. We have to rapidly automate, and that's never been more true than what we're looking at with the current crisis, where folks suddenly are saying, this is how I do my job. Let me help you automate this so that you can help me and I can continue to do my job in an effective way. And that's really important. Now, we may get to the point where folks are putting their hands on keyboards and developing for themselves. If I look at a development environment like Appian's, it's extremely accessible to a business user. But that model happens sometimes. Sometimes they're just sitting side by side with professional developers and getting closer to the software development process and just allowing it to happen much, much more quickly and in a much more reactive way. And then lastly, and this is a big one, it's not always that well received, so we'll put it last. We think you need a central technology governance model. We think you need standards. We think you need to have a consistent architecture. Again, these processes do not respect your organizational boundaries. So if you assume that any process could go anywhere in your organization across any set of legacy systems, a common way of accessing data, a common way of brokering privacy, a common way of ensuring security and compliance, a common way of training the users on what their role is in process optimization and process automation is your friend. So, we know we're coming off of this era where folks were working in silos and they were working very quickly, but this process imperative is making all that really, really difficult and driving us towards the recommendation of saying standardization is your friend. And ultimately, we know people don't like to be told, I'm sorry, we've standardized on this, you have to use this solution. But we think it's really important. You standardize on email, you standardize on spreadsheets. And we think there's going to be a lot of drive towards standardizing on process automation and intelligent automation technologies as well. So with that, I thank you. Here's my contact information. You can reach me at the email address listed here. And I just want to stop and say thank you to everyone for taking the time out of your day to listen. And I certainly hope this was helpful. So thank you all.